Welcome to episode 76 of Silver Lining for Learning. Today, we have to plan for a blended learning future and then plan again, because our two guests are going to talk about two reports. They thought they were going to talk about one, but the first one's already out and the second one's just about to come out. So we're going to get a sneak preview. This is what we are in Silver Lining for Learning. We seek out the new things that are just cutting edge and ready to come out, and we've got it here for you today. So we're going to have Nicole Weber from the Online Learning Consortium, an Associate Vice President, formerly with my alma mater, the University of Wisconsin Whitewater. Go Warhawks! The greatest football and basketball teams in Division C, Division 3, I mean. So Nicole will be talking about the report with her colleague, Tanya Jolston from UW-Milwaukee, where Chris and I were both raised. So we're going to talk some Milwaukeean here during this episode. We might fit in a bubbler and some cheese curds and some Johnsonville bratwurst, and who knows what else we'll be talking about. So you'll have to get an interpretation in the chat window, maybe a glossary for this. Tanya's been directing all sorts of stuff. If you read her bio in the blog post, it's just directing this, co-directing that, senior scientist this. And so the Director of Digital Learning, Research and Development, and co-PI and co-director of the national, not local, but national Research Center for Distance Education and Technical Advances at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and a senior scientist. And then it lists all the people she's helping across the state. She doesn't just deal with UW-Milwaukee, she deals with the entire system. And she's got the provost, if you read her bio, along with many other ears. So we're going to turn it over to them, Tanya and Nicole. I'm so delighted to have you here and get to talk Milwaukee Speak for an hour. Would you like to add to what I said about your bios and backgrounds? Because I think the directing that digital, that what's called DETA, is a big deal, that people don't know it's a big deal unless you explain it. So maybe before you show some slides about the Blended Learning Project, you could explain what DETA is, and maybe Nicole could explain a little bit about the Online Learning Consortium, because people probably do not know what it is, and maybe you can tell us about the conferences that you hold and it can get people to go. So let's start with those two things and then show some slides.
Okay, sounds great. Thanks, Kurt. So we call it the Data Research Center because data just sounds a lot cooler than DETA. And so we're just nerds like that. So we call it the Data Research Center, but it's the National Research Center for Distance Education and Technological Advancements. And that's actually the name that Congress gave it when it was appropriating funding for this sort of national center. And so I received a grant in 2014 to launch the center for $1.48 million from the U.S. Department of Ed, Fund for Improvement of Post-Secondary Education. So pretty much there was funding that was allocated in order to support research and identifying key factors that were influencing student outcomes in distance education. And when we talk about distance education, it's sort of an umbrella term. Nicole loves talking about umbrella terms. We also talk about blended learning as an umbrella term. Yeah, so when we talk about distance education, we're talking about digital or technology enhanced education. We're talking about blended or hybrid. We're talking about fully online, sort of anything under that umbrella, educational technology, and so forth. When we were naming the center, I wanted to keep the name distance education because I think it has a lot of historical significance in the field. And although in many ways things have evolved to focus more on terms like online learning and so forth, education captures teaching and learning. And again, as we know, the historical significance over, I guess, the last 50 years and even 100 years when we're talking about distance education. So it is a field in itself. And so we worked to develop numerous resources and efforts to conduct research to identify these key factors. The first thing we did is we launched the Data Research Toolkit because, you know, you all are from the field of education. I am not. I come from the field of communication, and a lot of folks that are working sort of in this digital learning distance education space, we come from all different sorts of disciplinary backgrounds. And I felt like we sort of needed a common language to talk about research and looking at different phenomena that were impacting student outcomes that were digitally enhanced. And so my background is actually from computer mediated communications, and sort of studying from that perspective. And so the data research toolkit, and actually thanks to the Every Learner Everywhere Network and WCET, the WICHE Cooperative of Education Technology, they just supported funding of a new version, which you can find on our website, dataresearch.org. But the first one, which we launched in 2015, was just to come up with somewhat of a common language about experimental studies and inferential studies and survey studies. And we actually were looking to fund research across the country with different universities. And we had dozens of universities that worked with us to put out some research that was doing exactly that, more or less identifying what works in practice, what is actually improving student outcomes, so that we could work to scale those practices across the country to improve the quality of digital, blended, and online. And so in a nutshell, I'll stop there. But since then, we've moved on and received funding from the Spencer Foundation, the Online Learning Consortium, WCET, the WICHE Cooperative of Educational Technology. Did I say Spencer Foundation? Every Learner Everywhere, and some other organizations. And so we're continuing our efforts there. And obviously those have changed a lot since the pandemic hit us. Nicole, do you want to talk about Online Learning Consortium?
Yeah, sure. So the Online Learning Consortium is, we're really dedicated to advancing quality digital, blended, and online learning. And we do this in a lot of different ways. We have, I'll just put a plug in. We have an awesome board of directors, which Tanya is so graciously on and helps, direct us as well. But we do a lot of really great things for the higher education community. So we do conferences and events. We just finished up our virtual with, I think there was over 2,000 people or so, our OLC Accelerate event, where we had just a lot of really great presentations. We brought together a lot of different great people for different summits around blended learning, like we're going to be talking about today, but also research and instructional design and different kinds of things like that. We also have an Institute for Professional Development that puts out workshops that really help support instructors, instructional designers, and those who are really looking to create really quality digital, blended, and online learning experiences. We also have a scorecard suite, which I work really closely with, that helps instructors and instructional designers and courses and programs and institutional strategy really think about how to move their quality dial forward. So that's just a little bit about what we do. You can learn a lot more about what we do at the Online Learning Consortium at our website at onlinelearningconsortium.org.
I have a couple quick comments before you show the slides that you have prepared. Tanya, it just sounds like the chips all fell once you got one grant, everything. You must have been just jumping because that was very competitive to get that huge grant, the 1.8 million. And I remember it, and I think I sent you a congrat note that day, or when your whole team must have been jumping up and down, because that was very important for this country and the direction that we're going. It was critical to get those, and I think Chris got some funds this week, or he was, I saw something go by my desk the other day of some AI money, Chris, or something like that. That's a huge amount, like 4 million or something. I'm not sure if that was the amount.
20
million. Okay, I was underestimating. Yeah, it was 20. Yeah. So I'm awed by these national leaders that we have with us today. And in terms of the board of directors at OLC, Peter Shea's my good friend, who pretty much does everything. He probably sweeps the floors when they're done with the conference. But we have to give a shout out to Karen Swan, who passed away a couple of weeks ago. My good friend at the University of Illinois Springfield, who's a lovely person, wrote many important papers in this field, and she'll be missed tremendously because of her leadership and really organization of many of us to do some stuff. She got many people organized and activated and so forth. So I just have to say, if you're watching the show later, look up Karen Swan, read a paper or two from her and the folks at Springfield, because they led the blended learning effort for a lot of the medium or mid-sized universities and getting the word out and what is possible to, many of these places wouldn't exist today without a blended approach. And they're the first ones, Grace Schroeder and Karen and others at Springfield. So would you like to, we have a couple things in the chat one, so maybe we might have a question or so. No, okay. Would you like to share those slides with us and explain what it is? I think it's about the first report, not the second report, right?
Yeah, we have some slides on both of them. And so I'll go ahead and share from here. And I should mention a little of the background, as you mentioned, Karen, and what a loss that we're feeling. And, you know, she's worked with data. She actually was our grant evaluator. She has been such a champion of our efforts at data. We also were on the board of OLC together. And actually, Karen was at the beginning of my start of blended learning as well. So at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, actually through a UW system grant, we started exploring blended learning in '99. I actually was a master's student, and then I left to go to Arizona State for my doctorate. But later I came back to Milwaukee because I can't stay away from brats and cheese curds, it appears. But I came back and we were starting, there was already a faculty development program that was sort of evolving, and I jumped on with that. And we were very lucky that OLC, previously the Sloan Consortium, gave us grants. And so we were part of that group: University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, University of Illinois Springfield, and lots of other great universities. And I talk about them in the guide that we're talking about today. Lots of those initial groups that were part of that, we called it the Blended Localness Initiative that Frank Myotis from the Sloan Foundation had launched. And so there is some historical significance. I think a lot of people are new to, and hybrid all of a sudden again is the trend word. We were using hybrid at University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee 20 years ago. When the Sloan Consortium gave us $500,000, we started calling it blended because that's what they preferred. So it's like hybrid and blended, as Frank Myotis would say, hybrid's a car. It's not an instructional or pedagogical approach. And so we really developed this guide as sort of an introduction to those that are new to hybrid or blended as a result of the move to emergency remote instruction because of the pandemic that that sort of required this distanciation in space. And so actually Nicole and I, and Nicole was part of our team at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee before, but we actually, have published in this area for many years. And back in 2013, we wrote an article on faculty development. And it's in this book, Blended Learning, by our colleagues, Chuck Zubin and Tony Picciano. Patsy Moskal and now Charles Graham have just actually released this week the third version of that. But back in 2013, like a lot of us, we already knew that blended learning was our future, right? And so in the Planning for a Blended Future guide that you can find at any of our websites, dataresearch.org, onlinelearningconsortium.org, or everylearnereverywhere.org, which are the ones who funded it. We sort of talk about the historical significance of blended learning, but also we incorporate it with research based on a systematic review, which I was just talking with Chris before we started here today. So a lot of us now, again, have this renewed sort of hope and just potential of what blended learning can do in our future. And so this is the guide that we've developed. Again, it was a collaborative effort. We are using some of our experience and research in order to inform this guide. And that's why we called it a research-driven guide for educators. I think there were lots of things coming out, right? But not a lot of them were research-driven. And so I tend to be one who's always looking at what the research is informing our practices. When I sort of accidentally stumbled into this area, it was because my background is computer-mediated communication. And of course, I'm thinking like, well, I've been studying all of this at the group and organizational level. The instructional sort of course level of this seems like an appropriate transfer. And so always looking at the computer-mediated communication research to inform it as well. So again, you can download it at everylearnereverywhere.org. And so as I was just mentioning, right, there's sort of this renewed sort of potential. I wrote an invited article for Inside Higher Ed about 6 years ago, just about blended learning. And the interesting thing, and what we know very well from the pandemic, is not all blended or hybrid learning is equal. And it's not just about mode, right? Like putting some stuff online or putting stuff remotely very quickly, that there's really some key pedagogical and instructional techniques that we need to use to ensure that there's some quality there. And so we talk a little bit about the promise of the blend. Nicole, do you want to talk a little bit more in detail about that?
Yeah, sure. I think, Tanya and I have talked about it a lot because we love blended, but we talk about it in the idea of it's kind of like the sum is greater than all of the parts, right? So when we talk about blended, the secret is actually that blend. So that strategic integration where we can really think about those practices and really think about your course's learning objectives and really think about what modality and what technologies really will help meet those learning objectives in the best way. So it's really kind of the best of those of both worlds, more than just that random mix, right? So it's really thinking really strategically about what is best and really where.
Yeah, and one of the areas that I've researched and taught in is around media choice and media selection. And so I really love like old theories by Daft and Langle from the 80s, talking about in organizational settings, like which medium is most appropriate for a task. And I think when we're talking about designing our courses, we need to think the same way. Which medium, meaning online or face-to-face, real time or overtime, synchronous or asynchronous, on-site or off-site, all of those sorts of things we need to consider when we are designing our courses and deciding what that blend is going to look like. Tony Picciano talks about in the first blended research book in 2007 about, the idea that you have red paint and you have blue paint, right? So if we think of online and face-to-face, but really what makes the blended is the fact when you put them together, you get purple. And Nicole's systems theory reference, I think, really gets to that. And so
it's also the idea, right? Like, I think we used to think about blended so black and white kind of, right? Like this idea of it's replacement of seat time, right? But I think we get so much deeper in the blended guide. And I always love, particularly in this resource, how we talk about the different dialecticals, right, Tanya?
Yeah, so we're going to jump into that now. First, when we started writing this is not what we were going to do at all. It definitely, I felt like we needed a guide for leaders to help them be more strategic moving forward. However, when I just wrote this little background piece on definitions, people were very interested in defining blended learning, even though I feel like we've done it a lot for the last 20 years. And so we expanded on that, and then we ended up coming up with a guide for educators because people were talking, and the reviewers and stuff, like they wanted more guidance on like what people could be doing, what faculty could be doing, and other educators in their course. So anyways, I mean, we talk about blended being this sort of umbrella term. In the guide, we talk about some of the other historical definitions of blended. And Kurt, I think we referenced some of your work with Charles early on back in 2005, and you guys have the handbook of blended. Tony Picciano, because of some work with the Sloan Foundation at a conference that we had back in 2005, came up with a collaborative and collective definition about blended learning. And so I really like dialecticals. There's a dialectical theory by Leslie Baxter on relational dialectics, but I think it's really hard to just come up with a definition of blended that encompasses what's been happening the last year, right? And so rather than come up with a definition, really we just needed a shared sort of understanding of what is blended and what could it be. So I had identified these 4 dialecticals. A lot of times we focus on technology, but obviously now with advancements and like Zoom, like we're on today, we need to talk more about all different sorts of modalities, technological, temporal, and spatial, which are pretty traditional. Peter Shea has a similar sort of construct of this. I believe that you and Charles did as well. I think one of the things that I've realized in my years and working on this is that pedagogical shift is what's most important, right? So moving from the instructionist approach or instructor center to more active learning. So we included that in sort of our 4 dialectical model of blended learning.
And I've got many of those books that you referenced, you know, sitting here
Oh yeah,
holding
that's
up,
the one.
holding up my computer. It's, you know, a heavy, a weight just to lift that up. But Charles Zubin has been on the show. So he's been on the show. Patsy's been on the show. Charles Graham is not my colleague with this. Maybe we should get Charles sometime. But you've hit all, you know, hit a lot of the key research areas and people and models and so forth. Does Young or Chris want to, but are you done with your slides, or and we can jump in now, or was there anything?
Yeah, we have more slides, but let's jump in and break it up.
You have more slides. Okay.
Yeah.
So we'll go back and forth then. Chris or Young, you want to jump in first?
Sure. I like the model. One thing that I find myself also thinking about is learner characteristics, because if you look at the spatial and the temporal dimensions, both of those differentiate in terms of learners. Some learners are more comfortable asynchronously, learners who think slowly but deeply, learners for whom English is not the primary language are examples of people who do better with asynchronous. And you know, the synchronous is more brainstorming, you know, rapid ideation, easier to look at getting collective intelligence going because it's all, you know, happening simultaneously. And similarly with remote and distant versus face-to-face. We see this with the pandemic, where parent after parent will talk about children who did better with remote, even when remote wasn't done very well, unfortunately, because they were in a situation where face-to-face wasn't being done very well either. So I think that that's an interesting kind of dynamic. I'll give a specific illustration and then throw it to you for your take on this. I'm teaching all online this semester, and Harvard uses Zoom, but I am meeting next week. I'm having the class meet in a Verbella virtual world, the campus of the Immersive Learning Network. And it's always interesting to me when that happens, because some people say, I love this campus. Why are we not meeting in it all the time? There's all this stuff that we can do that we can't do in Zoom. And other people are saying, I can't see their faces. I just see these graphical avatars and I'm lacking the body language and I'm lacking the facial expressions. So in a sense, Zoom is closer to face-to-face and iLearn is closer to really remote, but spatially it's more like face-to-face. So it's complicated, and it's complicated how learners respond. And I wonder what advice you would have for people who find that they have a highly differentiated set of learners in terms of what these spatial and temporal dimensions involve.
Tanya, before you answer that, you might take the screen off sharing, because we're in a really small space on the recording, so that we can get a bigger. We'll take advantage of Zoom's recording. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the reminder. Definitely. Yeah, I mean, I think you're totally right. So one of the things traditionally we've focused on with blended learning, right, is what is the pedagogical task, and less as to what are the learner characteristics that are going to influence preference and impact on outcomes. And so I think also we don't have enough research on that, right? Especially in light of the pandemic and all of the varieties of those 4 dialecticals that we're seeing. And the other thing, right, is face-to-face no longer means on site. So like for years, even if you go back to like Hiltz in the 70s, or I guess 82 Network Nation, And all of the like CMC versus face-to-face stuff, it was always just considered that face-to-face is on site. Now with the advancements in Zoom, face-to-face can mean lots of things. And so I think there's so much potential and work for us that has to be done to better understand. And so in the article, I talk about those dialecticals being levers. And so more or less, I think there's a series of levers, and that is just in the course model. That would be our process if we're thinking of input, process, output, and systems theory. So I think there's so many different options of that, those dialecticals in the course models. And then we're going to have to look at the different learners, their characteristics on which course models, where are those levers and how that's impacting which outcomes. So I'm really excited about all of the complexity of that and what we, and the work we have set, set in front of us for the next, till my career's over.
Yeah, I'll just chime in a little bit. I think Tanya's right on. I think we have to do a lot more research. And I think even when we're working on our own, courses and programs, we have to really think about, what our learners need and how to best match what we want to, get out of our program and course outcomes with the different ways to do that. I know even before I left the University of Wisconsin-Whitewater, I launched an instructional design and learning technology, fully online master's degree. And I still teach with them today. And, even the last weekend, some of my students were like, I know we're fully online, but I really love to be able to get together and dig into some of these things and do some different activities. So I think really thinking, as we're launching programs and thinking about redesigning programs, how can we best give them the best of both worlds?
I was muted, but I said, Tanya, you're planning long-term. Young has a comment. He wants to jump in here.
So I was just watching, this was triggered by Chris. I don't think you're describing blended learning. I think you're talking about blended instruction and blended teaching, because you are not really, designing the whole thing from a student perspective, right? I mean, if it's blended learning, you would talk a lot more about who the learner is, how the learner redevelop the learning process and the learning process. I think you're really talking about a blended teaching or blended instruction for students. I was actually quite interested in this topic now because of pandemic. We have a lot of students who have become autonomous learners, and they are the ones who are designing their own learning. They get on YouTube, they get on whatever, resources, they design their own learning. I was just wondering if have you done much research around that idea, how students design or construct their own learning? And that I would call blended learning.
So I should talk a little bit about our definition of blended learning and why we use the terminology blended learning and not blended instruction and not blended education. So the reason we use the term blended learning is because if we use the word blended instruction or blended education talking about teaching and learning, blended instruction talking about, the instructional approach or teaching itself. The reason we use blended learning is because we want to maintain a focus that learning is the goal. And so when we talk about blended instruction, we think about an instructionist approach. We think about the vessel is empty and it needs to be full. And so I've always felt that we need to talk about blended learning because at the end of the day, the focus should be on student learning and not necessarily just on instruction as it's traditionally been seen for the last 15 years. No, we do not. I do not have any research on co-construction of learning in blended contexts, and I actually think it's an area that's very limited. But I do think we're seeing more work, especially in, when we're talking about equitable learning and more co-creation of learning experiences.
Thank you. Thank you. You can continue. I was just wondering about that because I just think the individual ownership by students of the learning process is probably the most important factor towards the end. But go ahead, continue. Thank you.
So can people look up your report and find it? It'll be on the, it's in the blog that I posted, but is there an acronym or someplace that they can find all your reports at, and what would that be?
Sure, there's a lot of different reports. If you go to onlinelearningconsortium.org, in the tools navigation, you see all the different playbooks and different resources that we put together as a part of the Every Learner Everywhere network with different things. So we have the blended guide as we're talking about today, but we also have a Caring for Students playbook and some other ones as well. I believe that it's also linked off of the data sites and Every Learner Everywhere as well.
So the first report, the intended audience was what? And then explain that, and explain then the transition to the follow-up report and why that was needed so quickly as a follow-up. And did you get a break in doing the two?
No, Kurt, there's no breaks. There's no breaks in academia, right? No. So as Tanya talked about a little bit before, we were so excited to write about blended. We've always been excited to write about blended. We had, I don't know, 100, like over probably 100 pages in our original, like, we want to put something out about blended. And then what we saw was like, oh, we can cut this into a couple different pieces. And one was the educator's guide, which we're talking about today. And then we really thought, oh goodness, we really need to think about taking something a little bit larger than just courses and go into kind of what an institutional blended approach might look like.
We got a question from Punya's come in here. What has been the biggest mistakes do you see people doing, interpreting, applying your particular work here, particularly during the pandemic? So how has your work been misinterpreted, if at all?
This was really developed to guide people who already were out there for the first, for the last 18 months doing some version of emergency remote instruction, calling it hybrid, high flex, and so forth. And then realizing, wow, that didn't really work out very well. Like, I wasn't really a fan of that. My students weren't necessarily a fan of that. So this was sort of a little something. And in the report, we talk about sort of the three main factors in perfecting your blend or improving your blend. And those being focusing on more student-centered active learning, focusing more on integrating more strategically those four dialecticals. And then the third one being around scaffolding student learning, scaffolding being organization and chunking, module creation, as well as learner support. And so, we did a systematic review of blended learning. And I should mention, we did a digital trends report in January of 2020, highlighting blended learning as one of the trends, which is interesting because blended learning had sort of died before this. Like, I think a few of us were still like, blended learning is great. And most people were like, yeah, we're just either doing face-to-face or online or adaptive learning or something else really cool. And so because of the pandemic, coincidentally, blended learning became more popular. And so we incorporated those findings into the guide. So there's recent relevant research on how you can improve how you're doing blended or hybrid. And so that was a bit of a focus there. So this is actually, when you did it and it wasn't very great, now you can go to this as a very brief piece to sort of get you started on the new track. Now this fall, right, we had this big return to normal. So like, all right, this remote didn't work, this remote emergency restriction, high flex or hybrid or blended didn't work. Well, thank goodness we have the vaccine. Now we're just going to return to the campus. And then Delta came along and sort of ruined those dreams for some people. And so we always have felt like with proper faculty development and appropriate faculty development that implements some of the research and effective practices that will positively influence students' outcomes, those are things that people should be working towards moving forward.
Young has a follow-up question, and then Chris.
So this is great. So, I mean, I agree with you. I think blended learning or blended education, whatever you call it, this whole the mixed things is the future of education, has been, will have to become the future of education. So I'm just wondering, so you guys have reviewed the literature, you've written the papers, you've done all of this. And if I was going to go back to my own department, if I were going to run a professional development for my professors, colleagues at University of Kansas, and what are the 5 things I should tell them? You know,
Ooh,
they're
5.
designing courses, they're professor, do 5 things, you know, maybe 3 things, or maybe 1 thing. What should I tell them, Nicole or Tanya?
Sure. I'll kick things off by, I think one of the things, you know, and I think Tanya and I have been doing faculty development together for what, over like 10 years now. I think one of the things that we see probably folks struggle with the most is just the integration part that Tanya was kind of alluding to a little bit before. Is, you know, it's really important when you're thinking about, you know, using 2 different modalities like on-site and online. How do you weave those together into a course narrative that makes sense to students, right? Like, you don't want them to be just isolate, you know, like, oh, online, or here is our face-to-face work, and they never the twain shall meet, right? You want them to meet, and you want them to meet like intentionally and with purpose. So that's one of the big things, is sometimes students, they don't get the feel of that course narrative. So it's really about telling that course story and weaving those things together nicely. Because otherwise people, like students, might feel like one is more important than the other, or they're getting more out of different kinds of things. So I think that integration is one of the big things. I think the other one really is, I don't know, I kind of call this the magic. The second one would be the magic, I'll call it, right? Of really rethinking your course design and really thinking about backward design and blended course mapping, and really thinking about your course objectives and thinking about where it is you want to achieve each of those and what activities make sense in both of those. But those are my top 2. I don't know, Tanya, do you want to round out like a couple more?
Yeah, well, the first thing we always tell people is it's not the technology, it's the pedagogy. So when people start talking about blended learning or digital or remote instruction, you know, faculty are thinking about, how do I use the LMS? How do I use technology? How do I put what I'm doing face-to-face online? And really they need to throw all of that sort of out the window. And so I think they need to start focusing on, how do I move from an instructionist approach to a more student-centered active learning pedagogy? None of those words they probably know. And so it's just thinking about exactly that, like, how do you design and how do you sort of get, you know, like when I was teaching at Arizona State, it was like there was 16 chapters in the book, there's going to be 16 units. I lecture, then there's a catastrophic exam 8 weeks in, 30% of the class fails, but that's okay because those aren't going to be our majors. And so we sort of have to move out of that sort of weed out paradigm and start really thinking about what do we want our students to achieve. Nicole was talking about backwards design. In our study that we published in 2019 in the Online Learning Journal, we looked at all of these different factors that influence student outcomes in blended and online courses. And the number 1 factor is design and organization. So if we're going to tell the faculty in your department to start somewhere, it's identifying their learning objectives, how they're going to assess or document the student has achieved those learning objectives, and then thinking about the interaction with content, the interaction with each other and the instructor that are going to help students produce that documentation or evidence that they've achieved those learning objectives. So I think that's really where they start.
So before Chris jumps in, because he's going to take us in a new direction, I want to make sure there isn't a critical slide or 2 that you had left to show us, made in particular for the new report, so we get to see what that new report's going to look like, because I want to be cognizant of time. Would you like to give us a little inkling of it before Chris jumps in here?
Yeah, I'll talk a bit about so originally this started out being a guide for academic leaders to plan more strategically for the future, for this term or future terms. And so I love systems thinking. And so I was thinking more from systems thinking, how should we be reconsidering what we're doing in our institutions? And just moving through some images here in the report. So we talk about blended at the course level, right? And I was thinking, how do we scale that up, not only at the program level, but how do we scale that up to the institution level? And so in the next guide that we have coming out, we take more of an emphasis on encouraging academic leaders to have more strategic leadership. So I think there was a lot of like instant, like, Reactive leadership, like quick, get Zoom, get a technology infrastructure, use technology, keep people away from each other. And so one of the things we've been doing is developing a new institutional model that focuses on the characteristics of blended learning, but at scale. So focusing on the student at the center or the nucleus. And the reason that we're thinking we should do that is in using systems thinking and thinking about the external factors we need to. So normally we think about, right, students are in abundance, they pay tuition, that's our revenue. We have students that complete and graduate, that's really great. But what we know now, because of all of the external factors that are influencing our institutions, in order to sustain, we need to start thinking differently about our institutional models, right? So we have a pandemic, we have lots of economic changes in our country. So for example, you know, there's different markets now for jobs, different requirements in those. We have, you know, considerations about school loan debt, which is driving a demand for decrease in tuition. We know that equity is important with the resurgence of social justice for Black Lives Matters. And so in looking at these external factors, in the light of schools are closing, decreased enrollments, and all of these sorts of things, what do we need to be doing moving forward? And so that's where we propose thinking of the student as not an input into the system, but thinking of the student as the nucleus of the system. And then how do we build out from that using some of the key characteristics of blended? So students at the center, and considering that all students should have access and equity and success in institutions of higher ed, and looking at creating ubiquitous service and academic and social involvement for students through an integration of those modalities that I discussed with the 4 dialecticals. And we know from the research, for example, I just did a study with UW system throughout the system at all of the universities on the user experience with the LMS. But what we found out is only about 80% or only 20% of students actually want to return to on-site. 80% appreciate the flexibility and they're looking for more blended and online. And so we really need to think about that. Yeah, meeting the students at where they are, creating ubiquitous academic and social involvement throughout the institution, and not just measuring them based on completion, right? The student's idea of success might be very different than what the US Department of Education requires as a documented outcome of completion and graduation. And we see that the Department of Labor is making that change as well. And so we really need our outputs, or our students' success is going to be dependent on what they think of a success. And there's going to be alternatives to that beyond just college degree. So in a nutshell, that is what will be coming in the future here, is the idea of a blended institutional higher education model, and that at your institutions, you can start strategically thinking about this by implementing systems thinking and start transitioning to this kind of model.
You can take this off screen so Tristan and I can
Yeah.
jump in here, but I'll just comment first that Charles Graham, who co-wrote the handbook with me or co-edited with me, was the first one to talk about blending at the course level, blending at the program level, blending at the institutional level, blending at the class level. I mean, he was really thinking ahead back in 2000. This came out in 2006, so it was probably 2004 when he wrote it.
And Charles actually is one of our reviewers, Kurt, of the report.
He's at BYU, Chris and Young, so we might bring him in sometime. You might know him.
Yeah, he's provided us some really helpful feedback on the leadership guide that's coming out in the future.
Yeah, I think he got his master's at Illinois, and I think some of the Sloan Foundation money started there. And when he came to Indiana for his doctorate, he had been aware of those funds, and he had been doing work and research, and that propelled him. His work as a graduate student propelled him into the field, which is a good story, you know. So I really appreciate what you had to say there on the second report. I'm looking forward to that almost more than the first one, because I think it's going to have a huge impact on the leadership within the organization, which will snowball throughout the organization then. Chris, would you like to jump in at this point?
Sure. And Young, I loved your question about what would you say to colleagues. I can tell you my colleagues at Harvard will never ask me anything about technology. You have to be at least 50 miles away to be an expert, is my experience in terms of academia. I want to make a comment on the importance of the second report, and that is that in addition to curriculum and instruction, and in addition to the students, we have to look at what society is doing. I mean, ultimately, education is a means to an end. And the end is to help people become more successful by whatever their terms are in terms of work, citizenship, life, and so on. Work is now blended. That's not going back. Citizenship is now blended. That's not going back. Social life has been blended for a long time because of social media. So where are these people coming from who say, thank God we can go back to face only? What do they think is going to happen to their graduates? It's insane. And it pervades all the way down to, you know, preschool, all the way up. So I think when people finally wake up and say, wait a minute, we're actually a service organization and the people we serve are blended, that's going to help make a difference in terms of this issue. I want to talk about a research opportunity that I've been disappointed has not been occurring to the level I would have expected with the amount of remote learning that the pandemic has forced on all of us, and that is the opportunity to engineer learning. I co-edited a book on engineering learning in 2019 with my colleague John Richards and with Bror Saxberg, who is now at the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. The concept goes all the way back to Herb Simon, more than almost 50 years ago, more than 50 years ago, which shows the pace of change in higher education that now we're finally half a century later starting to think about this. And it works for online. So you can do A/B experiments online where half the students get one treatment and half another, especially in asynchronous learning. And you randomize and you do very quick conclusion. And here's where the important research insight comes. You're not concluding whether A is better than B. Though that research has gone nowhere. You're concluding for whom A works and for whom B works. And then you do it again with a different kind of intervention. Then you do it again with a different kind of intervention. And eventually, out of a large data set of students, you can personalize instruction because you know a lot about where somebody ended up in this range of different instructional strategies. So it's taking what you're doing in your first report and using big data and engineering approaches to try to get to personalization to the learner, which is what Yang was talking about. So I thought, hey, this book is out. People are talking about engineering learning. When remote learning comes along, we'll see it starting to happen. Not so much. So hopefully that will be something else that comes out. And in blended learning, it would be learning in the online part using these methods. But then you can bring the insights about the learner into the face-to-face part, even if that isn't where you're doing the experiments. So I don't know your feeling about that, but I feel as if this is an opportunity that's been defined, but that people are not taking advantage of by and large.
Yeah, I think you're right there, Chris. You know, I think, you know, what you're talking about is a lot about that really intentional integration of the different components, right? Especially leveraging the tools that we know have been working. I know that at the University of Central Florida, Patsy Moskal, Chuck Zubin, you know, all of those folks have been doing a lot of really great stuff around adaptive learning and data analytics and really leveraging that data for the insights and how to weave that, you know, into personalizing learning, but also into bringing that into active learning when we do blended sorts of things. So I think that's really important.
One of the things, we did some research on online learning readiness, and so we definitely understand that there's different characteristics of learner that are going to impact their success. I think one of the frustrations that I've had is that, sorry, my dog is barking, is that the sort of the habit to always just look at demographics, right? And so as I talk about in our equity report, you have to move beyond demographics to build more complex student profiles so that we can better understand students and better understand which interventions or which scenarios are going to work best for them and impact their outcomes. And so I do sort of have a call for that in the research review that we did in identifying interventions in relation to digital blended online or use of ed tech that are going to impact outcomes for racially minoritized students. So I think you're right. And I think that we're not seeing, for me, I'm just not seeing enough funding and support around these really cool things that I would love to research. And so I think you're right. I think we need to develop more advanced profiles and understand how those interventions work for which students. And I don't just think we should be looking at, hey, it's a Black student, there's an achievement gap, and putting it on the shoulders of them. We need to start building more advanced student profiles and starting to identify what actually that we can do at the course and program level or at institutional factors to impact their outcomes.
So Young will go next, and I'll ask Punya's question. But Chris put a comment in the chat that I think is really important for people to hear who are watching the recording later. So Chris, would you like to quickly just mention it for the recording?
Well, there are apps like UserForge, and I think there's now another app that is a competitor that is a little more generous in terms of the free trial period that can be used to create personas. They provide templates for different kinds of personas. And I urge my students to use those in the analyses they do of educational systems, because it really can help to have a disciplined framework for understanding who the students are.
Young, you want to jump in now?
Yeah, I just want to, again, I think Chris and I are really on this kind of here on the same page. Especially, I really want to highlight the autonomy of students, of individuals, because I've seen schooling really has been hurting students by and large. We pretend to teach them something, but that teaching may actually be doing more damage. You know, I just wrote a book called Learners Without Borders. So I think I was talking about blended learning, but really blended learning by the students. I don't think I used the term blended learning. As students really should be able to open to a host of any, I'm talking about K-12 students, of any resources. They reorganize that so they can use the apps, they can redesign this. So I'm just wondering if in the blended learning literature or in that circle, in your circle, are we talking about universities or schools trying to spend time or efforts to help individual students to own and to manage their own learning, and they become the active blender of their learning instead of just being blended into a blended model? So that was, so the idea is, do you guys have initiatives in that area?
Well, I think, one of the first things that needs to be done, Young, is we have to have the options out there for the students. And I think that's one of the biggest things that I'm nervous about of the pandemic, right? You kind of talked about it a little bit before, but the idea of, everybody wanting to go back to normal. And I just don't want us to slide back. I think a lot of institutions around, the country put some, money into some infrastructure starts, right, that are really important. So students being able to, have access to mental health services, to financial aid, to all of these really important things, no matter the distance and where they might be. I mean, not too long ago, for financial aid, you had to come and sign for something in person. Like sometimes you have to sign for your student IDs in person. So I think it's really kind of trying to meet the students where they are, no matter where they are, with different ways. And I really hope that we keep investing in different ways to do that. And I think we can do a lot more, across institutions as well, right? Like, just having, some services open past like 5 o'clock. Like, I know I wish my mechanic or my dentist was open after 5 o'clock. Some of these student services are really important and should be available a little bit more.
So Nicole, I know I completely agree with you. You can rely on existing policies, existing infrastructure. I'm just was wondering if OLC would say, okay, let's have a student division, the student run, they can go take different courses, do different things. I was just wondering about that. And by the way, I was just thinking about this. We saw everyone wants to go back to normal except everybody on this panel. No one on this panel wants to go back to normal. Okay, everyone else wants to go back to normal, maybe.
Well, I think everybody just wants, I think we should strategically think about what we want to keep, right? Like, I think, you know, it's hard to reflect on pandemic, right, life and what has gone, you know, good, because it's hard, because it's been a hard time, right? But I think we really need to strategically think about what is it? What did we learn that actually is worth keeping, and thinking about how to do that a little bit, you know, better.
Yeah, I'm accused of not being normal to begin with, because I'm a slacker, as the shirt says. And so I don't want to go back to normal at all. I'm going to ask Punya. To come back in and ask his questions, because we've got 5 minutes left. But the first thing Punya put up here was, a bit of a joke, but it's not a real joke here. The funny thing is that face-to-face has always been blended in some ways. If we take a kitchen sink approach, I mean, you put in some technology, you change your methods, all this. Yeah, the word blended, in Canada, when I went to work with the folks who had the national grant, the national grant there in 2000, Linda Harrison had it, and they called it mixed. She said, you in the US, you call it blended, and the military calls it hybrid. That was back in 2000, 2001, and it seems like for a while we edged over towards everyone using the word blended, and then hybrid became the word again, and the training around blended, it just goes up and down like a roller coaster. I'll get a call from the military one day, and then the next day, and then I won't hear from anyone for a year. I didn't know else, and then it goes boom, it goes up. It's the weirdest thing. You would think people would have been fully trained by now, just had a couple get vaccinated, but it's like they were discovering it again, like they discovered it in 2001, they discovered it in 2005, and they discovered it in 2000. It's the weirdest thing, I don't know. Do you have a comment about the cycle of the change process here in the terminology and in the attention paid to blended?
Well, I mean, everything that's old is new again, right? It was interesting. I was asked to give a talk at University of Central Florida recently on innovation. And it just, we have, the early adopters who are like, okay, we've been doing this forever, what's next? And then we have the late adopters that are like, oh my gosh, this is so new and so much stuff we have to do. But you're right, Kurt, in the late 2000s, we probably did a blended faculty development program for over 50 universities in numerous countries. And then it sort of died off. Even OLC decided not to do the blended conference anymore in 2015.
Yeah. Right.
Everything was sort of going. And I'm thinking like, wait, what are we doing? Like, this is the future. Work is blended. Everything's blended. Why is this losing power? Because everyone was like the new innovation or fully online. And yep, here we are again. Everything goes in waves, right? Everything is secular. And so, here we all are again. Maybe it'll catch on this time, right? Everybody will be blended courses, blended programs, and we'll finally start putting the students at the center when we think of institutional models.
We got a few minutes left, and Punya put a bunch of questions in the chat window. If he comes back in, he can ask them. Punya. One, he says, building on Chris's comment, what do you think are opportunities for big data analytics in designing better blended environments, particularly given the amount of data that we now have on our learners?
I'll jump on this one because I just actually keynoted the Unison conference and was talking about this. But sadly, I think it's not as great as it should be, right? We're building technology like learning management systems, and the data that they're collecting are sort of theoretically and practically useless. So, and I've been running around in this circle, I feel like for 15 years, talking to software architects about why they're not creating data that's more meaningful to us about the social interaction of students and using that technology that can help us build better statistical models in predicting outcomes while inputting more information about the learner characteristics or their student characteristics. And so I think where we're at right now is there are some limitations, specifically though, when we're talking about traditional traditional digital blended or online higher education. And so sadly, I don't think we're quite there yet. I am, as Patsy Moskal is as well, working on some student survey data mixed in with student information system data, mixed in with learning management system data to try to develop some of those more robust models. But sadly, what we know is exactly what we were talking about is design, and what's in that course box is what matters. And so we need to do a better job of better understanding that. And we can't do that right now with the current data that we're getting from the learning management systems.
Well, we've had an active discussion here for the past hour, and I'm really appreciative of hearing cutting edge research and finding out what's going to happen in terms of the next report, and having two experts come in from my homeland and Chris's homeland up in the great state of Wisconsin. And I hope that we can connect all together up there when the Wisconsin Distance Teaching and Learning Conference is held live again, face-to-face in Madison. And for the viewers, for people watching this show, look up the Wisconsin Distance Teaching and Learning Conference to be DTL, called DTL. It's fantastic. It's like a who's who. Chris has keynoted a couple of times. I mean, it's just a fabulous place in the Frank Lloyd Wright building that he designed 50, 60 odd years ago. So it's one of the most incredible conferences you can go to, literally, and cities you can go to. So go to that, visit Tanya, visit Nicole, they'll probably be there. Nicole and Tanya, thank you so much for coming in and sharing with us. And we'll talk a bit off screen afterwards. Young has to introduce our next show though. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I know we're about a minute over. Sorry about that, but that's an exciting conversation. Yes, next week, we're going to have Tony Wagner and Ted Dintersmith. And our topic is really going to be about what education should be and can be. I think today we had some conversation about blended learning or blended teaching, blended instruction, blended whatever you want to call that. It's and Ted and Tony have been writing a lot about schools. Their best product, and that's been best known, probably is called Most Likely to Succeed, a film they made about education. So next week, we want to talk about what education can be, what education should be, and what's the best way to achieve that from two of the leading thought leaders in education, Tony Wagner and Ted Dintersmith.